it's a great pleasure to introduce Frances. She's a good friend of mine, or more than a good friend, and also of the Havens Wright Center. You may not recall, but Patrick recently, or just now, reminded me with this, that Frances was the first recipient of the Havens Wright Center's Lifetime Achievement Award for social activism or social justice. What's the official title of the award?
Contribution to critical scholarship.
Contribution to critical scholarship. So she was the first recipient of that. And I've known Frances since, we were talking about it this morning, since the early 80s. It was after Reagan got elected, but you know, we've been good friends basically ever since, so about whatever that is, 30 years. As you know from the poster, she's an extremely distinguished academic and also an extremely distinguished activist. She's the Distinguished Professor Emerita of Political Science and Sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, an internationally renowned social scientist, scholar, activist with commitments to poor and working people above all else, and to the democratic cause that has never wavered. And if you know Frances personally, you'll know that she's the real deal. I mean, when we started the new party, she was one of the few people who, without hesitation, said, "Of course I'll speak for you. Of course I'll donate my proceeds to develop your, for speaking engagements to your fledgling little effort." And she's, probably know her books already: Regulating the Poor, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, How They Fail, Why Americans Still Don't Vote and Politicians Like It That Way, and Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America. These are among her books. This is not by any way a complete listing of all of her books. What can I say about Frances? Well, words do not aloft on air. This is a true American spirit, a great patriot, a winter soldier for democracy, Frances Fox Piven.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joel. As you can tell from Joel's comments, I've been giving lectures like this for a very long time. Well, what are these? I've been pontificating, in other words, for a very long time. And my subject is American politics, so I've been pontificating about American politics for a very long time. Now stop and think for a moment about just how hard it is to pontificate about American politics at this moment. And that's the situation I'm in. I have to do it. I said I would do it. I'm here. After all, those pontifications, those lectures, those books, those talks, those papers are based on a kind of method. How do we know what's going on or what will go on in politics or American politics? Well, usually we extrapolate from the past. So we think there's an election coming up. Who will vote? How many will vote? Well, we look at past elections and we decide, well, it might change a little, but probably not too much. And since we know what happened in the past, we can talk about what is going to happen in 2020. The same thing is true when we try to explain congressional votes, for example. We explain congressional votes by looking at what they did in the past, in the recent past maybe, or what executive orders are likely to be forthcoming from the White House. We look at what executive orders did come out of the White House, or what revenues the federal government collected in the recent past, or what trade agreements it struck in the recent. It's all extrapolation from the past. So how can we possibly talk about what's going on now or in the near future? It's become, American politics has become completely unpredictable. So you don't need me up here to lecture you about it, to tell you that it's unpredictable and that we don't know. We don't know. That's the way it is. Partly it's the president. This extraordinary president that we have, and his boasts and his threats, and his really cockamamie policies and policy turns and policy changes. And then, of course, there's also this, I think, pretty unprecedented feature of this government. The president has created a rabidly loyal following. And it's not small, it's big. It's about 40% of the American electorate. So it's a very strange time in American politics, and I don't think I would rely on anyone to tell me what's going on or what will go on in the near future. Think, for example, about the fascism quarrel among today's pundits. People are always correcting each other. Don't call it fascism. You don't know fascism if you call this fascism. Well, maybe it isn't what they mean by fascism, but it's a little bit fascistic, isn't it? And we seem to be moving down that road. I think it's a terrifying time, unpredictable and terrifying. And today, I want to make these words were actually a kind of excuse, because I'm going to try to give my version of why and explain why I think social movements in the United States might provide a glimmer of hope, although I intend to reserve my talk on Thursday for a deeper examination of the conditions which create social movements, the challenges they have to overcome, and why they might save us. Might. So, but today, mainly, my version of why. And I think anybody who tries to explain why this is happening in the United States today has to take account of the scale of these developments around the world. The center of American politics, namely the Democratic Party, is collapsing, crumbling. We can see the same thing happening to center parties across Europe and in the global south as well. The center is crumbling. So we have to have an explanation that is capable of explaining what's happening here in ways that take account of the fact that it's happening in many other places that don't have the distinctive features of American political culture or the American political rules. Well, I think a good beginning in the search for an explanation could take us back some 40 years to the work of James O'Connor. How many people remember James O'Connor? The more mature people in the room. James O'Connor wrote a book in the early 1980s that was called The Fiscal Crisis of the State. And for a moment in time, it created a great deal of excitement. There was a brief moment when it was the book to read, and James O'Connor was the hero of the left American Academy. It didn't last. I have no idea why it didn't last. I have no idea why intellectual fashions come and go as they do in the social sciences. I think probably a good explanation would be something like the coming and going of styles in the fashion industry. Depends on the market and depends on the number of people who are aggressively trying to get into the market. and push those who are already there to one side. Maybe that's the best explanation. But let's go back to James O'Connor, who I think should not have been pushed aside. What O'Connor argued in the early 1980s was that there were two functions. He used a word which quickly lost favor. Functions, functionalism. Let's leave that to one side, because it wasn't such a bad idea to think that an institution had to produce consequences that worked for the rest of the society to be sustained. That wasn't so stupid. But nevertheless, it lost fashion. But the two functions that the capitalist state had to fulfill were first the function of accumulation. It had to do what was necessary for the capitalist economy to continue to produce profits, to continue to accumulate wealth. That was the first. And the second was the state had to legitimize a class-divided society. The state had to give people the sense that there was a kind of unity, a kind of oneness in the society, and that it did this by making people feel that it was their government, that the government spoke for everybody in the society. Maybe that was democracy that made that possible, although O'Connor didn't go into that. Now, a rush of acclaim and excitement when the book was published. I remember arriving at a conference in Trieste, of all places, and everybody was talking about James O'Connor's book, The Fiscal Crisis of the State. And then silence. But I think we can actually learn something by going back to this argument, because I think one possible explanation, I'm not so sure, but why am I talking if I'm not sure, you might ask. One possible explanation for the politics of the moment in the United States is that the American government apparatus, the state, in pursuing the function of accumulation under contemporary conditions, destroyed the capacity of the state to legitimate a class-divided society. Think about that. It's possible, right? That an aggressive, accumulating state, or a state that aggressively encouraged accumulation in response, of course, to social actors, businessmen, crippled the legitimating capacities of the state. I think that's what happened. Now, why did it happen? And it happened basically in the 1970s and 80s. But it began in the 1970s. Everybody knows the famous memo produced by Lewis Powell that called on American business to wake up and organize and pressure government to facilitate business operations and business profits. That was what the Powell memo was about. And he wrote it for the Chamber of Commerce. And it was a blueprint for what happened in the 1970s. New think tanks were created, new lobbying organizations, K Street sprang up in Washington. I remember Washington, D.C. in the 1960s. It was a sleepy town. A lot of good things came out of Washington in the 1960s, largely in response to the Black Freedom Movement, but it didn't make it like Wall Street. The new developments did make it like Wall Street. So Now, if you follow Powell's argument, it's reasonable to think that this mobilization by business was a somewhat delayed reaction to the New Deal era in American politics and the accumulated consequences of the New Deal era, because the New Deal gave rise to unions, the New Deal transformed the Democratic Party so that it became something like a Labor Party. It was a party that turned out to be very responsive to the Black freedom movement. So it was in part a delayed reaction to the New Deal, but the delay and the reaction was probably provoked by the rise of competition from Western Europe, particularly Germany and Japan. After all, American business got a kind of time off, 25 years after World War II, when it confronted no international competition. It had a free path, a free ride, no competition. It dominated the world. And then Western European products, particularly German products and Japanese automobiles, some of you will remember that, began to crowd into the American market. And then at the end of the 1970s, the Arab oil embargoes created additional problems for American business because they raised the price of oil. Well, so business was in a way ready to respond to a call for political mobilization and aggressive lobbying that Lewis Powell sent out. And the agenda was perfectly clear. The agenda was, we have to compete, we have to become competitive, and the way to become competitive is to roll back the extra costs for business that were imposed essentially by the New Deal political agenda. The extra costs of policies that required higher taxes, the extra costs of business regulation to us, that is businessmen, the inhibitions imposed by the National Labor Relations Board and its protection of the right to organize, and then the unions that resulted, the big mass production unions that were shoring up labor wages and benefits, increasing the share that labor took of American productivity and profits. And then also the Democratic Party became, in the 1930s, sort of the party of labor, and later it also became the party of the Black freedom movement and the civil rights movement, with tremendous electoral shifts that resulted from the alignment of the Democratic Party with the Black movement. One consequence, of course, was that Republicans gained the presidency and held it more or less almost held it, with the exception of Jimmy Carter after the Watergate scandal. They held the presidency from 1968 to 1992. And then in 1994, a historically unprecedented change in the House of Representatives. Some of you will remember Newt Gingrich, the contract with America, and the House of Representatives was no longer a Democratic House. Meanwhile, it's true that a Democrat was elected president in 1992. That Democrat was Bill Clinton, a Southern Democrat. Bill Clinton did not have a New Deal agenda. Bill Clinton promoted and signed the crime bill, which resulted in the incarceration of lots of black men. He promoted trade agreements, which were the beginning of the devastation of the mass production industries in the United States. And in 1996, he signed the welfare bill, which followed through on his slogan, 2 years and off to work. He cut cash assistance to poor women and children, cut it dramatically. He virtually eliminated a program known as AFDC, which had in the 1960s expanded so that lots of black female-headed households lived on that program. Well, at the same time, the Powell-inspired business mobilization also has produced not only a shift in representation, electoral representation, but it also nourished the groups that were beginning to pop up that we came to recognize as the populist right. The John Birch Society, the Patriots, the militias, the Tea Party. These groups were not spontaneous, self-started groups. They were promoted and funded by business money. Well, that was part of it, but there was a kind of bigger program and bigger picture underlying all of these changes. And that had to do with a kind of intellectual development which asserted that changing demography in the United States would change our political history. The electorate was changing. And one way in which the electorate changed is blacks had become voters with their migration to the north and with the winning of civil rights victories. Also, women had become much more politicized. There were more Hispanic immigrants in the country at this point in time, mainly from Puerto Rico and not from Mexico and Latin America, but still their politics was different than the politics of the white middle class and upper working class voters who had been the main electoral constituency until then. And there was this idea, it was an idea on the left and on the right, that these changing demographic trends, including, by the way, the emancipatory culture that was paraded by the youth, that these trends would dictate America's political history. We were becoming a more diverse society, more black people, more Hispanic people, more young people who liked blacks because they were the heroes of their world of sports and culture. And also women. There was some emancipatory trends among women as well, although not as much as right now. What to do? You know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, socialists had believed that history would drive their political future, that inevitably historical trends would create a revolutionary proletariat that would bring socialism to the world. It was a brilliant theory in a way. It certainly was an energizing theory. It allowed people to think that history will deliver us. Well, there's a little bit of that going on in the United States. Demographic trends would build a progressive constituency, a progressive party. It would, in the United, would reshape the electorate. Now, the consequence of that was that Republicans, energized and on the move, worked to reshape that electorate, to undo what demography was creating, what demographic history was creating. And they did, that helps explain the rush of moves and strategies, tactics, to suppress voting, and the rush of moves also to change the translation of votes, change the formulae through which votes were translated into government representatives, government actors. Gerrymandering, in other words. Gerrymandering has always been part of American politics. Gerrymandering is built into the American Constitution. But this was a new rush, a new energy to figure out how to draw district lines in a way so as to change the results of elections. So Republicans, in a way, the Republican Party, now a business party, the Republican Party had a kind of confidence in electoral democracy. They sort of believed it could be their undoing, and that therefore they had to change the rules of electoral politics. The left was not so sure. The left has, in these years at least, has been very ambivalent about electoral politics, very unsure about whether they should emphasize electoral efforts. Now, I think some of you at least remember the 70s and 80s and the disdain that many people on the left had for electoral politics, which would co-opt movement activists, which would distract us from the real fight, which had to take the form, I guess, of direct action. So, but not the organized right. The organized right proceeded to try to cripple the right to vote. Really cripple it. Can you imagine that? I mean, this is the elemental building block of electoral democracy, the vote, the mass vote, the universal vote, or the near universal vote. To cripple that right, and also to cripple the formulae through which those votes were translated into representation. And they did that through a kind of peculiarity of American politics, which is that national elections get a lot of attention, or a fair amount of attention, and produce high turnout, but elections for state governments, not so much. Not so politics, that vote suppression and the escalated distortion of gerrymandering unfolded. Now this is very important because it really limited the most important features of electoral democracy, which have to do with voting and representation. That's the idea, right? Everybody gets the right to vote every few years, and if they're dissatisfied with their rulers, they kick them out. New ones come in, everybody discusses it. If they still don't like them, they kick them out again. But you can't do that if you don't have the vote, or if your vote is seriously reduced in determining who runs the government. So we're still in this situation. The election of 2016, which Trump lost by 3 million votes in the popular count, he won through the Electoral College. That's gerrymandering. It's historic gerrymandering, but it's still gerrymandering. And he is using sort of the central strategy to justify vote suppression and gerrymandering, which is, he calls the election a fraudulent election. He says it was those votes, those 3 million votes are fake votes. He says everybody is committing fraud except him. And he could well do this again in 2020, of course. In fact, he probably will do this again in 2020. And then if he loses, nevertheless, which he may well do, he will probably refuse to step down because it's a fraudulent election. And then what are we planning to do? I have no idea. Well, so this situation is, it's grim. I think it's grim. It's not entirely grim, and you know, I don't think it's particularly useful to go around saying, are you an optimist or a pessimist, or I am an optimist or pessimist. I heard a lot of that today. I've been around the building most of the day, and people want to know, are you an optimist or a pessimist, or I am an optimist or a pessimist. That's kind of silly, isn't it? You don't really get to have moods to dictate how you're going to live. You've got to do politics because politics is living. You've got to do it. You don't want to do it, that's a big mistake, because that's what life is. Life is trying to shape your environment and to do it with friends, family, colleagues, whatever. And life is full of failure, and life sometimes brings a little bit of success. So you don't have any choice, not really, except you to watch television and eat potato chips and get that. Moreover, we don't have a lot of time to try to prevent the catastrophe of global warming. So we have to drop this stuff about deciding whether we're optimists or pessimists and just do what human animals do, which is try to shape their own future. And we do that by forming groups and acting with other people to try to force the powers that be to pay attention to humanity. Now, it should be of some cheer to realize that throughout American history, people have done that, and they have sometimes been successful. You know, you probably learned in high school or junior high or grade school that the United States is the world's first democracy. You know, that's sort of true. It was a crippled democracy, but it still was a pioneer in developing electoral representative arrangements. And those electoral representative arrangements were pioneered by the masses, the mobs who fought the Revolutionary War. They got a lot of encouragement at that moment in history from American elites, merchant elites, who wanted, for their own reasons, to break the ties with Great Britain. They didn't like the constraints on trade and currency and military expenditure that Great Britain was imposing. So they wanted out, and they needed allies to fight a war to get out. And they found those allies by speaking the rhetoric of radical democracy for a moment, for more than a moment, for a few years. But they had to pay for that, and they paid for it by inserting into what was otherwise a very counter-revolutionary document, the American Constitution, by asserting the basic provisions for representation into the Constitution, mainly with regard to the House of Representatives, the People's House. So we got, in a way, the first configuration of an electoral representative institution as a result of the pressures brought by the mobs. They were called mobs, maybe they were mobs, who fought the American War of Independence. They were the radical Democrats. They had some great ideas. They thought, for example, that the legislature should be elected on an annual basis so that they could kick the bastards out every year. They thought also that they ought to be able to watch what they did from the balcony, I suppose. They wanted to keep close watch of their representatives in the state capitals. And they were right to want to do that. They didn't succeed because they were moving against the men of property who wrote the Constitution of the United States. But they did make a difference. They created the first electoral representative democracy. Flawed, distorted, all the achievements of radical Democrats have been flawed and distorted because the opposition is so intense. But doesn't mean they don't make an impact. Or think about the abolitionists. The abolitionist movement. Well, you could say there were strains of abolitionism even in the Revolutionary War era, but the movement really emerged in the 1830s. That means it was a very long-lived movement. It was a very wordy movement. I mean, it was a movement of religious people, church people. It was a movement that affected all of the main Protestant denominations, and a movement that so angered the South with its rhetoric, first with its rhetoric, and second by staffing and funding the Underground Railway, which bled slave property out of the South, that these churches split. You got Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists, Northern Presbyterians and Southern Presbyterians, and those splits foretold the split that was coming in the Union itself. So, but that movement had an amazing impact. It eliminated chattel slavery as a legal institution in the United States. Now you can get discouraged. Chattel slavery was followed by a Jim Crow system which reduced the freedmen to serfs. That's true, that's true. But it was better than chattel slavery. And in any case, the Black freedom movement of the 20th century moved further in the direction of abolition. It created more freedom for black people. Or think about the labor movement, which emerged in the 19th century, another long-lived movement, and achieved its great breakthroughs in the 1930s, winning the right to organize. You know, there was no right to organize. The right to organize was unions were struck down by the courts as monopolies. It was a fantastic movement which included sit-ins, takeovers of factories. Such a brilliant tactic. We need to use that tactic in new ways today. Think about it. They not only stopped production, which any strike will do, but they took over the factories, the capital, which made production possible, so they could not be replaced. I think it's worth some thought about how we can use sit-ins right now. Right now. You should do that, and I'll do it too. So, the bottom line, I think, is that movements, the resistance, which is an amalgam of several movements. It includes the women's movement, and the women's movement is going to become more fierce as a consequence of the attacks on reproductive rights, which are themselves giveaway to the evangelicals in the business-led coalition that is the Trump administration. So the women's movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to see a rising of poor people. Poor people always come later because they're more vulnerable. The youth, young people, the Extinction Rebellion movement. I think we are in the early stages. It's not before it. We're in it, but it's still early, of a period of movement activism which could change the United States, which will change the United States. There are no promises. We don't have a lot of time, but I can't help but think that this is a moment when movements are more necessary than ever before. Moreover, I don't think it's movements alone. I also think that electoral politics is changing. The Republican right is becoming more entrenched. It will not change. But the Democratic Party is changing. It may split. But we will have some electoral protection for these movements. I want, on Thursday, to talk about the nature of movement power and why it is so widespread, why there really is a lot of movement power. You have movement power. I have movement power. Everyone has movement power because we are all parts of a complex and fragile society that is made up of systems of cooperation, and we can shut them down. We all have that capacity. And we have to learn how to use it, and use it in the most strategic ways possible. But that's what I'm going to talk about on Thursday. Thank you. What do we do now?
Take some questions.
What?
Take some questions from
I'll
the
take
audience.
some questions. Okay, do you want me to?
Wait, the
All right,
talk
I'll-
was on Wednesday?
So,
Okay.
I just want to correct, the talk's on Wednesday.
Oh, it's Wednesday, not...
It's not Thursday, it's
Oh,
Wednesday.
it's not
I wanna make sure
Thursday,
that
it's
everybody knows.
Wednesday.
Tomorrow, we have to have tomorrow, nobody wants to miss tomorrow's talk, so we have to give them the right time.
Yes.
The right time is
Wednesday, not
4
Thursday.
o'clock tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you, Gay.
I'm so sorry.
I will come tomorrow.
I'm so
Yes.
sorry. Yeah.
Not Thursday.
Yeah, because I can't wait 48 hours for the answer to that question. I want to know the next step.
Yes.
One of the less
lessons that's been drawn in the public sphere about President Trump's various outbursts and all that is that we should be more civil to each other, we should be more responsive to each other. And I'm wondering how these lessons, however, they sometimes are linked to some golden age in which we had politicians hand in hand and doing cooperative things. Again, false, image. I'm wondering how that might undermine some of these initiatives that you're talking about resistance. How people might feel we have to be civil to each other now and perhaps not express ourselves in the way that we might need to in order to assert the very real and immediate demands that for example, poor people would have, etc.
I don't know. It doesn't move me particularly, the idea that we should be more civil. Trump is telling us to be more civil.
Well, I'm saying the reaction to President Trump, people
We
are
should
saying,
learn how to be polite and then he'll become polite? No, he won't. Believe me, he won't.
right, well, for example, there are new speech rules in universities that we're all supposed to, we're not supposed to confront each other in forums like this. There are all sorts of ways online that people who speak out in various ways are shut down, even though President Trump himself and other politicians are not shut down. I'm just saying this false sense that we should be civil could actually blanket and perhaps squelch, if that's a word, some of the uprisings that are so needed right now. Expressions of poor people who have no other way to express themselves than to take to the streets.
Well, listen, let's face it, being rude is not a powerful tactic. Using four-letter words is not going to scare anybody into being benevolent. So being rude is not really very important. I believe in being very polite to most people, but I don't think that I think it's a fake issue, a completely fake issue. We're not especially rude. Trump, as President of the United States, always uses four-letter words. To say nothing of four-letter behavior, I don't think it's an issue.
So.
Yes.
This may be more a question for Thursday, but I'm curious if there's all these locations of movements, why is there malaise in a variety of progressive organizations in places like Wisconsin and Madison?
Well, you've been through a terrible experience in Wisconsin, and my heart goes out to you. Because, I mean, you're one of the states that was hardest hit by the far-right mobilization, both political mobilization and business mobilization. And I think that, especially for people in Madison, it was probably quite a blow and a confusing as well, because you probably had confidence in Wisconsin and the Wisconsin tradition. However, take heart. The country is changing, and the movements are growing. It's a new era of movements. This doesn't happen very often. It's very important. It has enormous transforming potential. It's not too silly to think about how you want to change things, because you're going to be able to change things. But we're not in the middle of it yet. And we have to do something about the bullies and fascists who have been brought to power by Trump and his allies. You know, it's not just Trump. Trump isn't, I mean, he's got some sly kinds of cleverness, but he's basically an idiot. And a psycho. because he's so needy. I mean, he wants it all for him. He wants to stuff it all in his mouth. But it's not him. It's the people behind him, the people who have used his theatrical appearance to gain enormous legislative leverage. And that's the Koch brothers. It's Goldman Sachs, it's finance, it's the real estate industry. They're all behind Trump. That doesn't make it better. That in a way makes it worse, because that is also how fascism came to Germany. It wasn't Adolf Hitler that did it. It was the fact that the German cartels were glad to have him do it. So, yes.
Yeah, I think there's another factor going on. Since World War II, we've become an empire. 8 times as much percent of GNP in the Cold War as 150 years prior, and it continues. And in terms of political movements, if Roosevelt started something that sort of ended with Reagan in 1980, hopefully, is there a candidate that could maybe be the new Roosevelt this time and end this 40-year rightward movement that's gotten so extreme that we elected a Trump character who didn't do it with whistles, but told it out loud exactly where he was coming from and kind of unmasked the whole system prior.
Well, I think we have a number of candidates that might play that role. We don't quite know yet, but I think the sort of gallery of Democratic aspirants is pretty impressive. I think, I'm sorry that Sanders is old, because he is, but I like Bernie Sanders. I like Elizabeth Warren, don't you? Those are impressive people. And it'll be fine. But, no president is going to solve our problems. President is just going to be there, it's going to be on the masthead, but we have to push the president, and we have to have a Congress that can be pushed. And that's possible. That is possible. Terrible things are going to happen anyway. And the terrible things are going to, because climate change is pretty advanced. So it's going to be hot and smelly and wet. People are going to lose their homes and their livelihoods. We can't reverse that. We can try to limit it. That's the most we can do. We're late in the game, but it's time. It's time. Yes?
When you describe President Trump as extraordinary, do you mean by giving Erdogan of Turkey the green light to invade Syria? Or do you mean that he's pretending to do the sanctions against Erdogan of Turkey? Or is he just thriving in the crisis and enjoys the crisis?
I think he is a kind of an accident and a buffoon, and somebody that a character that we've never seen in such a prominent role, at least, in American politics. That's the sense in which I mean he's extraordinary. And for example, his incredible hunger for adulation, frankly expressed. This guy who says, I'm the one, I've made it better, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm saving the world, there's never been a president like... This is nuts. that's, and you know, there are people who go along with it, but we have a lot of sort of cultural fascists in the American population. So, Gay,
Okay, so I actually wanted to ask about politicians, see him cultural fascists. I'm struck in talking about the support for Trump, how little you've mentioned people like Mitch McConnell, and particularly the role of the judiciary, or the transformation of the judiciary, the sort of creating institutional powers that will limit social movements' ability to challenge anything. How do you undo that?
well, I think there was a time, about the time of the 2016 election, when a lot of people thought that the regular politicians, even if they weren't middle of the road or left, would restrain Trump. And we learned that they were going to take advantage of his buffoonery to drive through their policies. Trump doesn't have a policy on the environment. He couldn't care less because it has nothing to do with golf courses. So,
Actually, you can't really have a golf course without it.
well, you could have a golf course, I guess, in a swamp, but it probably doesn't work very well. So that it's okay with them for American institutions to be bad as they were, to be damaged even more, to get their tax cuts through, to get their deregulation program through. I don't understand I have to say I don't understand the extraordinary short-termism of this crop of leaders, both political and business leaders. Don't they think they're going to be alive in 2025? But they are short-termists. So we have to get rid of them. Get rid of them. Yeah.
That strikes me though as like pretty uniquely U.S. Right movements in other countries are able, at least on the stance of the environment, are able to unite their hard right populist stances with a climate, not a climate change denialism, but an acceptance of climate change.
Where?
Well, in places like Poland, in a lot of these kind of like fringe hard right movements, there's actually it's a sort of part of the xenophobic anti-migrant policy to say, when we have scarce resources, who will we make sure, in the face of looming scarce resources, who will we provide for? And it strikes me as a matter of, perhaps it's not something that, there's only a matter of time until that infusion comes to the U.S., simply for the point that you're making.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not prepared to argue with you, but I'm not sure. Certainly, somebody like Bolsonaro is a disaster for...
Or Putin. I mean, oil producing companies everywhere.
I guess I'm speaking more of the sort of the tendency in the hard right populists. Those are
I think that deserves more scrutiny because I'm not ready to agree with you, but I'm not ready to argue that you're completely wrong either.
I prefer to be wrong, let me be clear.
Such a nice spirit in this room. I began by saying, I don't know what's going on. Why should I pontificate? And now we're all agreeing. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm thinking about, in talking with my students recently, I'm observing a disillusionment and a frustration and a sense of the onslaught of information and the amount of bad news. It doesn't matter which issue they're most concerned about. It's not going well, it feels like, for them. And so I appreciate the perspective you're setting up, which is giving a longer view of things. I don't know that that younger people have it. I know need that help often. And I'm curious about how to push back against their frustration and their throwing their hands up and not knowing what to do and therefore disengaging because it's all too messy.
Well, it's all messy, but if you're working with a movement group, it doesn't seem messy. It seems energizing, inspiring. I think get them to join up and their attitudes will improve. And more young people are. The resistance started out mainly with, I think, the women's groups, and then the civil rights or human rights groups that fought against Muslim bans. But now I think under the umbrella of climate change, more and more young people are getting involved. And
Gun rights as well.
Extinction Rebellion is all over the world. So, you and then you. I'm sorry, I don't know anybody's name, but you can understand why, right? I don't care which one goes first. Fine,
I
go.
have lived in this country for the last 45 years, and all of them in Milwaukee. And I would have to say that at the beginning, when I first came, I think I kind of think that American people are very admirable. I think they are generous. They play fair. They play by the rule. But I think since the rise of Japan in the 80s, 9/11, and the rise of China in the last 2 decades or so, Americans are less likely to play fair, and I don't know how much of this Trumpist republicanism is a reflection of the American people just feeling insecure because they are being threatened and overtaken by somebody else.
Well, I sort of think you're right, that fair play is not a principle of the expanding populist right. That there's a kind of nastiness there. I'm not sure if it always was there on the right, but I think that might have to do with the extraordinary resentment that seems to be fueling white nationalism, right-wing populism. Extraordinary resentment at being displaced. I mean, can you imagine the chant in Charlottesville? Jews shall not replace us. Jews were not, there was no danger that Jews were going to replace them. What were they talking about? It was, in a way, imaginary, but it was an expression of deeply felt resentment because something or somebody is replacing them. Now, some observers think that the fact that we may be a majority-minority country in a couple of decades is the cause of that resentment. I'm not convinced by that because I don't think that people feel that it's a palpable problem in their lives, that by 2045 it's going to be a country made up of minorities. I mean, who could you feel a kind of urgent resentment about that? No, come on, doesn't make sense. What do they feel so resentful about? I think something about their cultural mythology has been spoiled by the rise of minorities, that may be, and the critique that minorities proffer of the American way of life, that may be. And then the decline of the American empire. You said that the issue of American empire was very important. Maybe. Certainly it is to the British. Look at how crazy they become when they don't have empire to fall back on.
I was just going to ask, what do you think is the role of academia in movement building?
I don't think academia has a very big role. It may be the institutional setting which allows, protects the development of some nodes of protest among students in particular. That would be good. I think that universities, and this is a whole other subject, universities are in huge trouble that they are themselves being transformed as an institution. They have become the institutional frame for some of the worst precarious labor practices in the country. And faculty went along with it, absolutely went along with it. I think, for example, in my university, City University of New York, I think that there was a conscious decision. We were a unionized university way back when hiring adjuncts became the ready-made solution to budget problems. And I think the union went along with it because they wanted to preserve the salaries of full-time tenured faculty, which were high comparatively at that time. So there's that, and there's the growing role of administrators who are in a kind of tacit class war with faculty. So what do they do with their money? And they're in control of the budget. They hire more administrators. You have provosts and associate provosts and vice provosts, and you don't know what they do. Nobody knows what they do. They don't know what they do. They hire for-profit educational consultants to monitor what the faculty does. It's true. There were all sorts of procedures all sorts of things we did at the university. Some were useful, some were not. We had little contests, we evaluated proposals or essays, blah, 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 blah. We did that all the time. And we filled out forms ranking the submissions. Now there's an internet program through which we have to answer questions about it's stupid, completely unnecessary. And the for-profit educational consultants invented it. And they invented it so that they would get paid. And it's fine with the administrators who are, some of them at least, they become real estate men anyway. Yeah.
I want to go back to the question of how to interact with young people. When my dad, who was born in 1908, was politically active in the 20s, the organizations he belonged to, Student League for Industrial Democracy, Young People's Socialist League, things like that, were offshoots of adult organizations, of parties as well. And we have these fractionated, climate change, extinction this, extinction that. We don't have a broad scale organization that adults would be the mainstay of, and young people, I know this is hierarchical and it doesn't give the young people agency, etc. But I think young people would be thriving a lot more if there were adult organizations that they could affiliate with.
Well, there are some. They can affiliate with the ACLU, or they can affiliate with People for the American Way, or, there are a lot of organizations. And they're all fine at this point in time. I might want to have a fight with some of them at some other point about some other issue, but they're fine now. They're doing good work. They're doing the kind of work they can do. But no problem. I don't see the problem. But if you think there's a problem, form an organization.
Joel is the leader of one of them.
Jolie, are you the leader of an organization?
Not really.
He's so modest. Yes.
just something positive about what we're going through with President Trump. I had a theory for a while that President Trump's just the bombosity or whatever, bambosity, thank you, very good. That we would be able to see very clearly what is going on in, say, the Republican Party and in parts of the Democratic Party and the conservative movement in general, because he was so open about his racism. He was he's still undisguised about his motives. And this would be clarifying. In the Republican Party especially, people had code words for everything. And all of a sudden those code words were no longer functioning, and we had Charlottesville. We could see with the torches and all of that exactly what was going on in a clear way. And I'm wondering whether or not that has continued, if we've learned our lesson. Do you think that we have decoded and taken the rhetorical tools away from, say, Republicans and again, some Democrats, conservatives, who would want to proceed in what they were doing in terms of racism and all sorts of other ways of opportunism and greed, but again would want to fall back into those old codes?
I think his base has not been persuaded, has not been informed, not been educated by the public way in which he sort of announces his traits. His base likes it.
Yeah, and that's revealing. Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing in some ways. I mean...
no, it isn't, because those people are here. We have to live with them. They're going to be part of our politics for a long time, and they are very, very poisonous. Yeah.
Well, just to demonstrate, I'm old enough to have been in a world where sexism was open. You could just, someone would say in his classes, I don't want women here, I don't like you being here, and all of that. That was just obvious in this building, but it was good in some ways because I could identify those people. And now everyone knows the coded language. Okay, the professors, the same theories are there, in many of the individuals, but they've learned how to get along with the affirmative action HR coded talk. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is happening in terms of tomorrow's coded talk, or where we're leading? Will we be able to recognize racism in the future for what it is, in the way we have so clearly done with President Trump?
Well, I don't think we have with President Trump. We have.
Okay.
But we always recognized racism, I think. But a lot of people love him for his expressions of racial hate. And I think what we've learned is that there is a large chunk of the American population is racist, is macho, is lazy, delights in the defamation of women. What did you say, Joe?
Is deplorable. Yeah, be careful.
Yeah, be careful with the word.
Be careful?
Well, just, it was just a remark to Pete. It just sounded almost like Hillary asked, painting a very, very broad brush on all these people who are supporting him.
Okay, but anyway, I think it's a little bit of romanticism to think all we have to do is connect with those people.
Totally agree. Yeah, not disputing that at all, and nor disputing the fact that there's a huge amount of racism and weaponized resentment of elite-sponsored decline in living standards. Not disagreeing at all.
Okay. Yes.
I'm curious to hear, what do you think the empirical markers are going to be for when we move from the beginning of this movement era to the middle of it? And what are you looking for to know that this wave of movements has started to be successful?
Has started to
be successful.
Well, I think I want to look for reversal of the attacks on environmental regulation that the Trump administration has sponsored. I want to see a reversal of the cuts in programs for poor people, the huge cuts that are being promoted, they haven't happened yet, by the Trump administration, huge cuts in the food stamp program, for example. I want to see I would want to see some action on criminal justice. Now, I don't think that the Trump administration has been the villain in this case. I think it's states and localities and state and local politicians who have been the villains. But there's no reason the federal government can't take a more aggressive posture with regard to criminal justice. I want to see the policies of the National Labor Relations Board reversed so that they are pro-union, not anti-union. We have to do something about healthcare. I mean, we have the most absurd and predatory healthcare system, never mind in the world, that you could imagine in your worst dreams. So there are a lot of ways in which I want to see policies change. And I want to see them change in a direction which protects the political capacities and the living standards of ordinary people. That's what I would look for. I also want to see the threat of war diminished. What do you want to see?
Childcare.
Could I follow up on that question?
Yeah.
I may have misheard the question, but I thought it was not about what are the policies we'd like to see after the movements coalesce and actually have some force of some sort, but rather how will we know when they have force? Imagine a picture, show me a picture, you know, does it look like San Juan and a government being toppled by a mass demonstration? Does it look like Zuccotti Park and a bunch of people getting attacked by New York cops? Or what's the picture you have of how we'll know when then these different diverse movements are coalescing to a point of critical agency?
Well,
I thought that was the question. Maybe it wasn't the question.
Well, I wouldn't put the emphasis on coalescing. They may or may not coalesce.
Okay.
So I think that I'll know that the movements are on a roll and in a position to change American politics when I see rank upon rank of school teachers marching in the streets and millions of people cheering from the sidelines.
Okay.
I'll know that we are on a roll, that we are going to win.
Okay. Yeah, all right, good. That's
All
the
right,
marker.
so I'll watch for that. You watch for that too.
Did we get to your question right?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right.
Yes.
I wanted to bring James O'Connor back in, and I think it was in this fiscal crisis where he was also talking about he used the phrase the warfare welfare state, which am I right? So and what I thought he was doing in that was also talking about the ways like social movements had, I think in his read, needed within the U.S. also needed to be anti-imperial, and so that brings back to as a basis of like having a social benefit, that would be the only just way to do so. And so I wonder your thoughts on, like, imperialism has come up a few times, and I see that one way in which the anti-war movement has sort of ebbed and flowed, but one way in which we can see it's actually kind of strong is in immigrant rights and sort of supporting people who, say for thinking about sanctuary, for example, in the 1980s. But I wonder, yeah, your thoughts on the warfare-welfare connection and where anti-imperialism would fit within this moment, as Trump has sometimes said.
Oh, but those are two separate
Yeah, those are
questions,
two
right?
separate questions, but yeah.
Okay. Well, the welfare question is interesting because I don't think a lot of people on the left agree with me about that issue. I am fiercely against workfare programs.
Oh, I meant warfare, welfare.
Oh, warfare.
Warfare,
Warfare, welfare.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not workfare.
There is this other issue
Yeah.
where, you know, the sort of traditional left has always promoted full employment and varieties of work programs as solutions to poverty. And I'm critical of that. I think it's a very limited approach. But that has nothing to do with welfare. I have to say, I don't have a solution to, is it human nature? Human nature somehow transcribed into the nature of nations? That we're so murderous? I don't know. I'm not very optimistic about solutions because the solutions seem not to have a strong grip on what national leaders do. I think we should try, but I think also that there may be features of, I was going to say our culture, but it's everybody's culture, virtually everybody's culture. Not everybody's, but virtually everybody's culture that makes us so warlike, makes people, you know, at the beginning of every war, there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement. It's almost just sexual excitement. It's horrifying. And it's not just men, it's women too. I think we have, I don't know what to do about that. Does anybody? Yes?
I don't have an answer, but to her question, there's a new book, recent book that I bought that's sitting on my shelf before, called Nervous States.
Okay.
Does anybody know more about that? Does it respond to her question? Has anybody seen it?
No, I haven't seen it.
Nervous States.
Joel tells me that it's time to end.
I do, yeah.
Tomorrow.
Next week, tomorrow, not Thursday.
Back tomorrow.
We'll be resumed. Okay.